Listen carefully, Nigeria. 3 minutes ago, I detained your military C-130 jet and arrested your 11 officers in Bobo Dioulasso. You thought your military could land in Burkina Faso without asking permission. You believed ECOWAS gave you authority to violate our airspace whenever you wanted. You watched smaller nations bow to Nigerian pressure for decades. You were wrong about Burkina Faso. I seized your aircraft, detained your crew, and held them until you begged for release. Burkina Faso's airspace is ours and Nigeria doesn't control it anymore. Let me tell you exactly what happened. On the 8th of December 2025, at approximately 2100 hours, a Nigerian Air Force C-130 Hercules military transport aircraft entered Burkina Faso's airspace without prior authorization and landed at Bobo Dioulasso International Airport, our country's second-largest city. The aircraft carried 11 Nigerian military personnel, including crew members and officers traveling for unspecified purposes. My security forces immediately surrounded the aircraft, detained all personnel on board, and secured the military equipment. I ordered that the aircraft and crew remain in Burkina Faso custody, pending full investigation of this unauthorized incursion into our sovereign airspace. Nigeria's government claimed the landing was emergency procedure due to technical difficulties. I rejected that explanation as inadequate justification for violating our airspace without permission. The Nigerian Air Force initially claimed their C-130 experienced technical malfunction, requiring emergency landing at the nearest available airport, which happened to be Bobo Dioulasso. They argued that international aviation protocols allow emergency landings without prior authorization when aircraft safety is at risk. They demanded immediate release of their personnel and aircraft, claiming that detention violated international norms regarding treatment of military personnel in distress. The Nigerian government issued diplomatic statement expressing concern about the detention and calling for swift resolution. ECOWAS leadership, dominated by Nigerian influence, issued statements supporting Nigeria's position and calling the detention unnecessarily provocative. I rejected every aspect of Nigeria's explanation because the evidence contradicted their claims and their assumptions about Burkina Faso's compliance with Nigerian preferences were fundamentally wrong. First, the technical malfunction story was suspicious because the C-130 is extremely reliable aircraft with multiple redundant systems that rarely require emergency landings. Second, even if genuine emergency existed, international protocol requires aircraft to request emergency landing authorization and explain the nature of the emergency, which this aircraft did not do. Third, the aircraft's flight path suggested it was operating a surveillance or transport mission rather than experiencing genuine emergency. Fourth, Nigeria's immediate diplomatic pressure and ECOWAS coordination indicated this was a calculated test of Burkina Faso's sovereignty rather than innocent emergency. The Alliance of Sahel States, which Burkina Faso leads alongside Mali and Niger, issued joint statement on the 9th of December 2025, supporting my decision to detain the aircraft and crew. The statement declared that Nigerian aircraft violated Burkina Faso's airspace without authorization, that emergency landing claims were unsubstantiated, that Burkina Faso acted appropriately to secure its territory, and that ECOWAS had no authority to override Burkina Faso's sovereign decisions regarding airspace control. The AES statement represented coordinated response by 3 countries that withdrew from ECOWAS precisely because of Nigerian and Western domination of that organization. Our statement made clear that former ECOWAS members would not accept interference from organization we rejected. Listen carefully to why this incident matters far beyond the specific details of one detained aircraft. Nigeria has historically treated West Africa as sphere of influence, where Nigerian preferences override smaller countries' sovereignty. This attitude reflects Nigeria's status as Africa's largest economy, most populous country, and strongest military power in the region. For decades, Nigerian governments assumed that regional leadership meant other West African countries would defer to Nigerian positions, accept Nigerian guidance, and accommodate Nigerian interests, even when those interests conflicted with their own sovereignty. Smaller countries typically complied because Nigerian economic and military power made confrontation costly. Burkina Faso, under my leadership, operates under completely different principles that reject Nigerian regional dominance and assert equal sovereignty for all nations regardless of size or power. When Nigeria's military aircraft entered our airspace without authorization, I had 2 options: accept the violation and release the aircraft quickly to avoid confrontation with Nigeria, or detain the aircraft and crew to enforce our sovereignty regardless of Nigerian displeasure. Previous Burkinabe governments would have chosen the first option to maintain good relations with Nigeria and avoid ECOWAS pressure. I chose the second option because maintaining sovereignty is more important than maintaining good relations with countries that disrespect that sovereignty. The detention sent multiple strategic messages simultaneously. To Nigeria, it communicated that Burkina Faso will not tolerate airspace violations even by Africa's largest military power. To ECOWAS, it demonstrated that former members will not accept interference in our sovereign decisions. To other West African countries, it proved that standing up to Nigerian pressure is possible and does not result in catastrophic consequences. To our population, it showed that our government defends national dignity against all challengers regardless of their size or power. Each of these messages was necessary to establish Burkina Faso's position in post-ECOWAS West African order. Nigeria's response to the detention revealed their assumptions about regional power dynamics and their frustration when those assumptions proved incorrect. Nigerian officials expected that diplomatic protest would result in quick release because that is how previous Burkinabe governments responded to Nigerian pressure. When I maintained the detention despite diplomatic statements, Nigerian government escalated to threatening unspecified consequences if the aircraft and crew were not released immediately. When threats also failed to change my position, Nigerian officials appeared genuinely surprised that Burkina Faso would prioritize sovereignty over maintaining good relations with Nigeria. Their surprise revealed how deeply Nigerian regional dominance assumptions were embedded. The Nigerian Air Force claimed their C-130 was on routine training flight that experienced mechanical difficulties requiring emergency landing. My intelligence services investigated this claim thoroughly and determined it was false. The aircraft's flight path did not match training mission profile. The crew included intelligence officers whose presence on training flight made no operational sense. The aircraft carried surveillance equipment beyond what training missions require. The timing coincided with increased Nigerian intelligence gathering regarding Burkina Faso's military partnerships with Russia. All evidence indicated this was intelligence mission disguised as training flight, that the emergency landing was either fabricated or deliberately induced to provide cover for landing in Burkina Faso without proper authorization. I ordered detailed inspection of the aircraft to document its actual capabilities and mission equipment. The inspection revealed surveillance systems, communication intercept equipment, and intelligence gathering tools that confirmed the aircraft was conducting reconnaissance operations. I ordered that Nigerian officials be informed of our findings and given opportunity to explain why military aircraft conducting intelligence operations entered our airspace without authorization. Nigerian government refused to acknowledge the surveillance equipment and insisted on maintaining the technical emergency story. Their refusal to admit the truth demonstrated contempt for Burkina Faso's intelligence capabilities and assumption that we would accept obvious lies rather than confront Nigerian power. The 11 detained Nigerian military personnel were treated according to international standards for detained foreign military personnel. They were provided appropriate accommodation, food, medical care, and communication access. They were not charged with crimes or subjected to interrogation. They were simply held pending resolution of the diplomatic situation created by their unauthorized entry into our airspace. The humane treatment was a strategic decision, demonstrating that Burkina Faso respects international norms, even while enforcing sovereignty. It also removed any legitimate grounds for Nigerian complaints about mistreatment that could have justified more aggressive Nigerian response. ECOWAS' response to the detention was entirely predictable given Nigerian dominance of that organization and ECOWAS' opposition to countries that withdraw from its authority. ECOWAS issued statement calling the detention provocative and unnecessary, demanding immediate release of aircraft and crew, warning that the incident threatened regional stability, and suggesting that Burkina Faso was acting irresponsibly. The statement reflected ECOWAS establishment's view that maintaining organizational unity and respecting regional power hierarchies matters more than defending smaller countries' sovereignty. The statement also revealed ECOWAS leadership's frustration that Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger successfully withdrew from the organization and formed alternative alliance that challenges ECOWAS relevance. Listen carefully to the geopolitical context that makes this incident strategically significant. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger withdrew from ECOWAS in January 2024 after determining that the organization served Western and Nigerian interests rather than Sahelian security needs. We formed the Alliance of Sahel States as alternative framework for regional cooperation based on genuine sovereignty rather than hierarchical relationships favoring larger powers. ECOWAS leadership, particularly Nigeria, viewed our withdrawal as threat to their influence and has sought opportunities to pressure us into reconsidering or to demonstrate that life outside ECOWAS is difficult and costly. The Nigerian aircraft incident provided ECOWAS with opportunity to test whether Burkina Faso would comply with Nigerian preferences despite our withdrawal from the organization. If I had released the aircraft immediately, it would have proven that ECOWAS withdrawal was symbolic rather than substantive, and that Nigerian influence over Sahelian countries remained intact. By detaining the aircraft and maintaining detention despite ECOWAS pressure, I proved that our withdrawal was genuine break rather than negotiating tactic, and that Nigerian influence over Burkina Faso has ended permanently. This demonstration was essential for establishing credibility of AES as independent regional bloc. Nigeria's assumption that ECOWAS membership historically entitled them to preferential treatment in member countries' airspace revealed their fundamentally hierarchical view of West African regional order. Nigeria believes that as regional hegemon, they should enjoy privileges that smaller countries do not have, including ability to operate military aircraft in neighboring airspace with minimal restrictions. This belief reflects colonial-era thinking about spheres of influence where powerful countries control weaker neighbors. It contradicts principles of sovereign equality that should govern relations between independent nations. Burkina Faso's detention of the aircraft rejected this hierarchical model and asserted that all nations have equal sovereignty regardless of size or power. The technical details of aviation protocols supported Burkina Faso's position completely. International aviation law allows emergency landings when aircraft safety is genuinely at risk, but it requires aircraft to communicate emergency status, request landing authorization, and explain nature of emergency. Nigerian C-130 did none of these things before landing. It simply entered our airspace without communication and landed without permission. Even if genuine emergency existed, failure to follow proper emergency procedures meant the landing violated our sovereignty. Nigerian refusal to acknowledge these violations demonstrated their assumption that procedures applying to other countries do not apply to Nigerian military operations in West Africa. My decision to detain the aircraft for 24 hours before releasing it was carefully calibrated to achieve strategic objectives without escalating unnecessarily. 24 hours was long enough to conduct thorough inspection, document surveillance equipment, send clear message about sovereignty enforcement, and demonstrate that Nigerian pressure would not produce immediate capitulation. It was short enough to avoid creating genuine crisis that could justify Nigerian military response or provide basis for international condemnation of Burkina Faso as unreasonable. The timing proved that detention was about asserting sovereignty rather than hostility toward Nigeria, and that Burkina Faso can make strategic decisions rather than emotional reactions. The release of aircraft and crew after 24 hours occurred after Nigeria provided formal diplomatic communication acknowledging that landing occurred without proper authorization and expressing regret for the incident. Nigerian government did not explicitly apologize, but the acknowledgement of improper procedures represented significant concession from country accustomed to other nations accepting their actions without complaint. The Nigerian statement also notably did not repeat the emergency landing story, implicitly acknowledging that the explanation was inadequate. These diplomatic concessions, however subtle, represented Nigerian recognition that Burkina Faso's sovereignty must be respected. Listen carefully to reactions from across West Africa that revealed deep divisions about regional power dynamics. Official government responses largely supported Nigeria because most West African governments remain in ECOWAS and depend on Nigerian economic relationships. Their support was diplomatic necessity rather than genuine agreement. Private communications from several West African officials indicated admiration for Burkina Faso's courage to stand up to Nigerian pressure and interest in whether asserting sovereignty against Nigeria is a viable strategy. Popular reactions on social media across West Africa showed overwhelming support for Burkina Faso's actions, with many people expressing frustration about Nigerian regional dominance and celebrating that smaller country successfully challenged that dominance. The incident accelerated discussions among other West African countries about whether ECOWAS membership serves their interests or primarily serves Nigerian and Western agendas. Senegal, Guinea, Togo, and Benin all have populations and political factions questioning ECOWAS value and considering whether withdrawal might serve national interests better. The successful detention of Nigerian aircraft without catastrophic consequences demonstrated that ECOWAS withdrawal is a survivable option rather than national suicide. Every country that begins questioning ECOWAS membership weakens the organization and strengthens alternative frameworks like Alliance of Sahel States. This dynamic shift represents fundamental change in West African regional order. Nigeria's inability to force immediate release of the aircraft despite diplomatic pressure, ECOWAS support, and implicit threats revealed limits of Nigerian power in post-ECOWAS West African order. Nigerian influence historically derived from combination of economic relationships, military superiority, and organizational dominance through ECOWAS. Countries that withdraw from ECOWAS and diversify their economic partnerships reduce their vulnerability to two of these three influence mechanisms. Nigerian military superiority remains, but military intervention to force smaller countries to comply with Nigerian preferences would be internationally costly and domestically unpopular within Nigeria. The result is that Nigerian power in West Africa is declining as countries recognize they can resist Nigerian pressure without facing consequences they cannot manage. The Alliance of Sahel States' coordinated response to the incident demonstrated that Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger operate as united bloc rather than isolated countries vulnerable to external pressure. When ECOWAS issued statements supporting Nigeria, AES issued counter-statements supporting Burkina Faso. When Nigerian officials threatened consequences, AES leadership indicated that consequences against Burkina Faso would be treated as consequences against all three AES members. This collective defense mechanism makes pressuring any single AES member significantly more difficult and costly. The coordination proved that AES is functional alliance rather than symbolic declaration, and that Sahelian countries can provide mutual support replacing what they previously received from ECOWAS. Western reactions to the incident revealed their frustration with declining influence in West Africa generally and Sahel specifically. Western governments issued statements calling for de-escalation, urging dialogue, and suggesting that the detention was unnecessarily provocative. These statements reflected Western preference for maintaining ECOWAS as vehicle for Western influence in West Africa and Western opposition to alternative regional frameworks like AES that operate independent of Western guidance. Western criticism had zero impact on my decision-making because Burkina Faso no longer seeks Western approval for our foreign policy or security decisions. The ineffectiveness of Western criticism demonstrated that Western influence in Sahel has collapsed completely. The incident also tested Burkina Faso's partnership with Russia, which provides military equipment, training, and intelligence support. Russian officials issued statements supporting Burkina Faso's sovereign right to control its airspace and enforce aviation protocols. Russian intelligence services shared information about Nigerian military aircraft operations that helped us assess whether the C-130's mission was genuinely emergency or intelligence operation. Russian military advisors consulted on appropriate responses to the incident that would assert sovereignty without unnecessary escalation. The Russian support demonstrated that our partnership provides practical benefits beyond just military equipment and that Russia supports African countries defending sovereignty against both Western and African regional hegemons. Nigerian domestic politics complicated their government's response to the incident. Nigerian opposition politicians criticized the government for allowing national humiliation where smaller countries detained Nigerian military aircraft and personnel. Nigerian military leadership expressed frustration about civilian government's inability to secure quick release. Nigerian public opinion was divided between nationalist anger at perceived disrespect and recognition that Nigerian government's failure to request proper authorization created the problem. These domestic pressures limited Nigerian government's options for responding because backing down appeared weak but escalating risked making situation worse. The domestic political constraints on Nigerian response demonstrated that even regional hegemons face limitations when dealing with countries determined to defend sovereignty. The detention proved that sovereignty is not determined by size, wealth, or military power, but by willingness to defend it regardless of costs. Burkina Faso is smaller, poorer, and weaker than Nigeria by every conventional measure. But we detained Nigerian military aircraft, held Nigerian military personnel, and maintained detention despite Nigerian pressure because we prioritized sovereignty over Nigerian approval. Nigeria is larger, wealthier, and stronger, but they could not force release of their aircraft without costs they were unwilling to pay. The outcome proved that determined defense of sovereignty defeats numerical superiority when the stronger party is unwilling to accept costs of compelling compliance through force. Listen carefully to lessons that other African countries should learn from this incident. First, asserting sovereignty against regional hegemons is possible and does not result in catastrophic consequences if you are prepared to accept diplomatic costs. Second, organizational membership should serve national interests rather than constraining national sovereignty, and organizations that primarily serve hegemon interests should be abandoned. Third, alternative regional frameworks can provide mutual support, replacing what traditional organizations provided. Fourth, diversifying partnerships reduces vulnerability to pressure from any single partner or regional power. Fifth, popular support domestically provides political foundation for foreign policy that challenges regional power hierarchies. Sixth, coordinating with countries facing similar pressures creates collective strength that isolated countries lack. The Nigerian aircraft incident will be remembered as a turning point when smaller West African countries successfully asserted sovereignty against regional hegemon and established precedent that other countries can follow. This was not first time Nigeria faced diplomatic friction with West African neighbors, but it was first time smaller country detained Nigerian military assets and maintained detention despite sustained pressure from Nigeria, ECOWAS, and Western powers. The precedent is powerful because it demonstrates that Nigerian regional dominance depends on smaller countries' voluntary acceptance rather than insurmountable Nigerian power. Once one country refuses to accept that dominance and survives the confrontation, other countries recognize they can do the same. Before this incident, conventional wisdom held that Nigerian preferences must be accommodated because costs of confrontation were too high. This belief was based on Nigeria's status as Africa's largest economy with GDP exceeding $450 billion, most populous country with over 220 million people, and strongest military in West Africa with over 130,000 active personnel and sophisticated equipment. Conventional analysis concluded that confronting Nigeria would result in economic retaliation through trade restrictions, diplomatic isolation through ECOWAS, and potential military pressure. Small West African countries calculated that accommodating Nigerian preferences was less costly than confronting Nigerian power, so they consistently deferred to Nigerian positions, even when those positions conflicted with national interests. This conventional wisdom created a self-reinforcing cycle where Nigerian dominance appeared permanent. Because countries believed confrontation was too costly, they never tested whether Nigeria would actually impose those costs. Because they never tested Nigerian willingness to impose costs, they never discovered that Nigerian power was more limited than assumed. Because they never discovered those limitations, the belief in Nigerian dominance persisted and shaped all countries' calculations about how to interact with Nigeria. The cycle maintained Nigerian regional hegemony not through active coercion but through other countries' assumptions about what would happen if they challenged that hegemony. After this incident, countries recognize that confrontation is manageable if you are prepared for diplomatic criticism and willing to forego Nigerian approval. I detained Nigerian military aircraft knowing it would generate strong Nigerian reaction, ECOWAS condemnation, and Western criticism. All three materialized exactly as predicted. Nigeria issued diplomatic protests demanding immediate release. ECOWAS published statement calling detention provocative and unnecessary. Western governments urged de-escalation and dialogue, but none of these reactions produced consequences that threatened Burkina Faso's core interests or forced policy reversal. Nigerian economic retaliation did not materialize because our trade with Nigeria is limited and easily replaced through partnerships with other countries. ECOWAS isolation was meaningless because we already withdrew from ECOWAS and built alternative framework through Alliance of Sahel states. Western pressure was ineffective because we no longer depend on Western approval or assistance. The gap between predicted catastrophic consequences and actual manageable outcomes revealed that Nigerian power was significantly overstated. Countries throughout West Africa observed that Burkina Faso confronted Nigeria directly, maintained confrontation for 24 hours despite sustained pressure, secured diplomatic concession from Nigeria acknowledging improper procedures, and emerged from the incident with enhanced rather than diminished sovereignty. This observation fundamentally changes calculations about whether confronting Nigeria is a viable strategy. If Burkina Faso can successfully challenge Nigerian dominance despite being smaller and weaker, Then other countries can do the same if they are willing to accept diplomatic costs that proved manageable. The psychological shift from assuming Nigerian power is insurmountable to recognizing it is limited fundamentally changes West African regional dynamics and creates space for genuine sovereign equality to replace hierarchical relationships. Hierarchical regional relationships depend on weaker countries, believing that stronger countries possess overwhelming power that cannot be effectively resisted. Once that belief is disproven through successful resistance, the hierarchy begins collapsing because its foundation was psychological rather than material. Nigeria's actual power did not decline between December 7 and the 9th of December 2025, but perceptions of Nigerian power shifted dramatically when Burkina Faso demonstrated that Nigerian preferences could be challenged successfully. That perceptual shift creates space for other countries to assert sovereignty in ways they previously believed were impossible. Genuine sovereign equality means that all countries possess equal rights to control their territory, make their own decisions, and resist external interference regardless of differences in size, wealth, or military power. This principle is foundational to international law but rarely realized in practice within regional systems where power imbalances create de facto hierarchies. West Africa has operated under a hierarchical system where Nigeria's preferences carried disproportionate weight in regional decisions, where ECOWAS policies reflected Nigerian interests more than collective West African interests, and where smaller countries modified their policies to accommodate Nigerian positions. The Nigerian aircraft incident created opening to replace this hierarchy with genuine equality, where Burkina Faso's sovereignty is equally valid as Nigeria's regardless of our smaller size. The implications extend far beyond Burkina Faso-Nigeria relations to reshape entire West African regional order. If Nigerian preferences no longer automatically dominate regional discussions, then ECOWAS must either reform to reflect genuine collective interests or face additional withdrawals by countries seeking alternative frameworks. If smaller countries can successfully resist Nigerian pressure, then regional policies must be negotiated among equals rather than imposed by hegemon. If sovereignty can be defended against regional powers, then external powers, including France and United States, lose leverage they exercised through regional organizations. Each of these implications represents a fundamental shift in how West African regional politics operate. Listen carefully to how other West African countries are already adjusting their calculations based on Burkina Faso's experience. Senegal, which has historically maintained close relationship with France and cooperated with Nigerian regional leadership, is now publicly questioning ECOWAS effectiveness and considering whether membership serves Senegalese interests. Guinea, which experienced military coup in 2021 and faced ECOWAS sanctions supported by Nigeria, is evaluating whether remaining an organization that sanctioned them makes strategic sense. Togo and Benin, both of which depend heavily on port revenues that could be threatened by Nigerian economic pressure, are reassessing whether that vulnerability requires permanent deference to Nigerian preferences or whether diversifying partnerships could reduce Nigerian leverage. These reassessments are occurring because Burkina Faso demonstrated that life outside ECOWAS is viable and that Nigerian pressure is manageable. Before Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger withdrew from ECOWAS in January 2024, conventional wisdom held that ECOWAS membership was essential for economic integration, regional security, and international legitimacy. The three countries' successful operation outside ECOWAS for nearly 2 years disproved that conventional wisdom. Their economies did not collapse. Their security situations improved through alternative partnerships with Russia. Their international relationships diversified toward non-Western powers. The successful withdrawal demonstrated that ECOWAS membership is optional rather than mandatory for West African countries' survival and development. The Nigerian aircraft detention added second crucial data point. Not only is ECOWAS withdrawal survivable, but countries outside ECOWAS can successfully confront ECOWAS members, including Nigeria, without catastrophic consequences. This combination of successful withdrawal and successful confrontation fundamentally undermines ECOWAS cohesion because it proves that the organization's claimed benefits are overstated and its claimed leverage is limited. If ECOWAS cannot prevent withdrawals and cannot compel compliance from countries that withdraw, then ECOWAS power is far less than traditionally assumed, and countries have less reason to prioritize ECOWAS preferences over national interests. Your legacy? Nigeria, Is declining regional influence because you assumed smaller countries would permanently accept your dominance rather than recognizing that dominance depended on their voluntary acceptance? You built regional influence on foundation of economic relationships that you assumed were irreplaceable, military superiority that you assumed was decisive, and organizational control through ECOWAS that you assumed was permanent. You never seriously considered possibility that countries might withdraw from ECOWAS and survive, that they might diversify partnerships and reduce dependence on Nigerian trade, or that they might be willing to accept diplomatic confrontation costs to defend sovereignty. These assumptions were fundamental strategic errors that are now costing you the regional hegemony you took for granted. You thought ECOWAS membership entitled you to operate military aircraft in member airspace without proper authorization. This assumption reflected broader Nigerian attitude that regional leadership meant preferential treatment in neighboring countries' sovereign spaces. Nigerian military aircraft historically flew throughout West Africa with minimal restrictions because member governments accommodated Nigerian security operations as price of maintaining good relations. Nigerian intelligence services operated across the region, gathering information on regional developments, monitoring potential threats, and maintaining awareness of political dynamics. Nigerian diplomatic personnel moved freely with assumption that their movements would not be questioned or restricted. All of these practices reflected Nigerian assumption that regional leadership entitled them to access that other countries did not enjoy. Burkina Faso's detention of the C-130 rejected that entire framework. We asserted that Nigerian military aircraft have no greater right to operate in our airspace than aircraft from any other country. We demanded that Nigeria follow same authorization procedures that apply to all foreign military aircraft. We enforced our aviation protocols without exception for Nigerian regional status. We treated Nigerian military personnel as foreign military personnel, subject to our jurisdiction when operating in our territory without proper authorization. Each of these actions communicated that Burkina Faso does not recognize Nigerian preferential status and will not provide special accommodation based on Nigerian regional power. You believed your economic and military power meant Burkina Faso would never detain your military assets because the risks of Nigerian retaliation outweighed any benefit from asserting sovereignty. This calculation would have been correct if Burkina Faso remained dependent on Nigerian economic relationships and isolated from alternative partners. But Burkina Faso has systematically reduced Nigerian leverage over the past 3 years since I took power. We diversified trade relationships toward China, Russia, Turkey, and other non-Western partners who do not coordinate with Nigeria. We built military partnership with Russia that provides equipment and training superior to what we received through ECOWAS frameworks. We formed alliance of Sahel states with Mali and Niger that provides regional security coordination, replacing what ECOWAS theoretically offered. We withdrew from CFA franc currency system that tied our monetary policy to French and Nigerian preferences. These strategic moves reduced Nigerian leverage to point where threat of Nigerian retaliation no longer constrained our sovereignty decisions. The reduction was systematic and deliberate rather than accidental or circumstantial. When I took power on the 30th of September 2022, Burkina Faso remained vulnerable to Nigerian pressure through multiple channels: economic dependence on Nigerian trade, security coordination through Nigerian-dominated ECOWAS frameworks, diplomatic isolation risks if we challenged regional consensus, and lack of alternative partnerships that could replace Nigerian relationships. I recognized immediately that defending Burkina Faso's sovereignty required reducing these vulnerabilities systematically before we could afford to confront Nigerian dominance directly. The past 3 years have been dedicated to building independence that made the aircraft detention possible. Economic leverage reduction began with trade diversification away from Nigerian dependence. Burkina Faso historically imported significant volumes of goods from Nigeria, including refined petroleum products, processed foods, manufactured goods, and consumer products. Nigerian businesses viewed Burkina Faso as a captive market where they faced limited competition and could maintain profitable operations. This trade relationship gave Nigeria economic leverage because threatening to restrict exports could harm Burkinabe consumers and businesses dependent on Nigerian supplies. I systematically reduced this leverage by developing alternative supply relationships with China for manufactured goods, with Russia for petroleum products, with Turkey for processed foods, and with other African countries for consumer products. By 2024, Nigerian imports to Burkina Faso had declined by over 60% compared to 2022 levels as alternative suppliers filled market share that Nigerian businesses previously dominated. The trade restructuring was strategically designed to ensure that Nigerian trade sanctions would hurt Nigerian businesses more than Burkinabe economy because we import more from Nigeria than we export, meaning sanctions would cost Nigerian exporters their Burkinabe market while we source products from alternative suppliers. This asymmetry is crucial for understanding why Nigerian economic retaliation did not materialize after aircraft detention. Nigerian businesses that previously sold to Burkina Faso recognized that trade sanctions would permanently cost them market access, as alternative suppliers established relationships with Burkinabe importers. Nigerian government faced domestic pressure from business interests not to impose sanctions that would harm Nigerian exporters more than Burkinabe economy. The result was that Nigerian economic leverage that appeared formidable in 2022 had essentially disappeared by 2025 when the aircraft incident occurred. Security coordination independence required replacing ECOWAS security frameworks with alternative arrangements that did not depend on Nigerian approval or participation. ECOWAS historically provided security coordination mechanisms, including joint military exercises, intelligence sharing, counterterrorism cooperation, and crisis response frameworks. These mechanisms gave Nigeria influence over West African security policies because ECOWAS security decisions required Nigerian consent, and Nigerian military capabilities were essential for implementing regional security operations. I systematically withdrew Burkina Faso from ECOWAS security frameworks and built alternative security architecture through 3 channels: bilateral military partnership with Russia providing equipment and training, alliance of Sahel states with Mali and Niger enabling regional security coordination independent of ECOWAS, and Volunteers for Defense of Homeland program mobilizing 50,000 civilians for territorial defense without external dependence. By 2024, Burkina Faso's security capabilities had improved significantly, while our dependence on ECOWAS security cooperation had disappeared completely. Russian military equipment, including helicopters, armored vehicles, and advanced weapons systems, enhanced our military capabilities beyond what ECOWAS frameworks provided. Russian military advisors improved our tactical effectiveness and operational planning. AES security coordination with Mali and Niger enabled intelligence sharing, border security cooperation, and joint counterterrorism operations, replacing what ECOWAS theoretically offered. VDP mobilization provided territorial defense capabilities that did not depend on external support. The cumulative effect was that Nigerian threats to withhold security cooperation or block ECOWAS security assistance became irrelevant because we no longer depended on either Nigerian military support or ECOWAS security frameworks. Diplomatic isolation risks were neutralized by building alternative diplomatic relationships that provided international legitimacy and support independent of ECOWAS or Nigerian approval. Traditional analysis assumed that ECOWAS membership was essential for diplomatic legitimacy in West Africa, and that challenging Nigeria risked diplomatic isolation that would harm our international relationships. I systematically built diplomatic partnerships that made this assumption obsolete. Russia provided diplomatic support at UN Security Council and other international forums. China expanded diplomatic engagement and economic cooperation. Turkey deepened bilateral relationships including diplomatic, economic, and military dimensions. Iran, which faces similar Western pressure, provided diplomatic solidarity. Multiple non-Western countries demonstrated willingness to engage Burkina Faso bilaterally, regardless of our ECOWAS status or relationship with Nigeria. By 2025, diplomatic isolation through ECOWAS was meaningless when we already withdrew from ECOWAS and built alternative regional framework through Alliance of Sahel states. ECOWAS could condemn our actions, but those condemnations had no practical impact because we operated outside ECOWAS institutional frameworks. ECOWAS could threaten diplomatic isolation, but we had already diversified diplomatic relationships to point where ECOWAS isolation affected only our relationships with ECOWAS member countries, while our broader international engagement continued expanding. Nigerian diplomatic pressure through ECOWAS mechanisms that previously would have compelled policy modifications became irrelevant noise that we could safely ignore without diplomatic consequences we could not manage. Nigerian military pressure would be domestically costly within Nigeria for several reasons that Nigerian government fully understood. First, Nigerian military operations against Burkina Faso would require explaining to Nigerian population why their military was attacking West African country rather than focusing on domestic security challenges, including Boko Haram insurgency in northeast, banditry in northwest, separatist tensions in southeast, and general insecurity affecting Nigerian citizens. Second, military action over detained aircraft would appear disproportionate and would generate domestic criticism questioning government priorities. Third, military casualties in operations against Burkina Faso would be politically costly for Nigerian government. Fourth, military action would consume resources that Nigerian military needs for domestic security operations. All of these domestic political considerations made military pressure essentially unavailable as tool for compelling Burkina Faso to release detained aircraft. Military action would be internationally condemned by countries and organizations that generally defer to Nigerian regional leadership but would not support Nigerian military operations against smaller West African country. African Union would condemn military action as violation of AU principles regarding peaceful resolution of disputes. United Nations would face pressure to condemn Nigerian military operations. Western countries that generally support Nigerian regional leadership would find it difficult to defend Nigerian military action over detained aircraft incident. Russia and China would condemn Nigerian military action and support Burkina Faso diplomatically. The international condemnation would harm Nigerian diplomatic standing far more than the aircraft detention harmed Nigerian interests, making military action strategically counterproductive from Nigerian perspective. Military pressure would be strategically counterproductive because it would drive more West African countries to question Nigerian intentions and accelerate movement away from Nigerian regional leadership. If Nigeria responded to aircraft detention with military threats or action, other West African countries would calculate that maintaining good relations with Nigeria provides inadequate protection against Nigerian military pressure when disagreements arise. Countries would accelerate efforts to reduce Nigerian leverage through trade diversification, security cooperation alternatives, and diplomatic relationship building with non-Nigerian partners. ECOWAS cohesion would weaken further as members questioned whether organizational solidarity with Nigeria was worth the risk of becoming targets of Nigerian military pressure. The long-term damage to Nigerian regional influence from military action would far exceed any short-term benefit from compelling Burkina Faso to release aircraft more quickly. The result is that Nigerian power to retaliate was far more limited than Nigerian government assumed when their aircraft violated our airspace. Nigerian officials likely calculated that aircraft detention would be brief because Burkina Faso would fear Nigerian retaliation and release aircraft quickly to avoid confrontation. This calculation was based on outdated assessment of Nigerian leverage that did not account for 3 years of systematic vulnerability reduction that I had implemented precisely to enable sovereignty assertion against Nigerian pressure. When Nigerian retaliation failed to materialize because economic sanctions would hurt Nigeria more than Burkina Faso, because ECOWAS isolation was meaningless, because military pressure was unavailable, Nigerian government was left with only diplomatic protests that had no practical effect on our decision-making. We calculated correctly that detention risks were manageable because we understood our reduced vulnerability to Nigerian pressure better than Nigerian government did. I had spent 3 years systematically preparing Burkina Faso for exactly this type of confrontation by reducing dependence on Nigerian economic relationships, building alternative security partnerships, diversifying diplomatic engagement, and creating regional framework through AES that provided mutual support. These preparations meant that when confrontation opportunity arose through Nigerian aircraft's unauthorized landing, we could afford to enforce sovereignty because we had already neutralized the leverage mechanisms that would have made enforcement prohibitively costly. The successful detention without catastrophic consequences vindicated the strategic preparation and proved that sovereignty assertion against regional hegemons is possible when countries systematically reduce their vulnerabilities. You watched other West African countries defer to Nigerian preferences for decades and assumed that pattern would continue indefinitely because you misunderstood why that deference occurred. The misunderstanding was fundamental and revealed Nigerian assumption that regional dominance reflected inherent Nigerian superiority rather than specific power relationships that could change. Nigerian officials observed that Senegal deferred to Nigerian positions on regional security, that Ghana accommodated Nigerian preferences on ECOWAS policies, that Ivory Coast coordinated with Nigerian leadership on economic issues, that Benin accepted Nigerian influence despite sovereignty implications. Nigerian government concluded from these observations that Nigerian power was overwhelming and that smaller West African countries had no realistic alternative to accepting Nigerian regional leadership. You believed countries deferred because Nigerian power was overwhelming and resistance was futile. This belief reflected common pattern where dominant powers misunderstand the sources of their influence and assume that acquiescence reflects recognition of insurmountable superiority rather than calculation that accommodation costs are manageable while confrontation costs are prohibitive. Nigerian officials believed that GDP exceeding $450 billion, population exceeding 220 million people, and military with over 130,000 active personnel created power differentials so large that smaller countries had no choice but to defer. This belief was factually wrong because it ignored that power is relational rather than absolute, and that smaller countries can resist larger powers when they reduce vulnerabilities and build alternative partnerships. The actual reason was that countries calculated that accommodation costs were lower than confrontation costs given their dependence on Nigerian economic relationships, their membership in Nigerian-dominated ECOWAS, and their lack of alternative partnerships. This calculation was rational and defensible when it was made. Countries that depended on Nigerian trade for significant portions of their imports faced real costs if Nigerian sanctions restricted access to Nigerian markets. Countries that participated in ECOWAS security frameworks depended on Nigerian military capabilities for implementing regional security operations. Countries that lacked alternative partnerships had limited options if Nigerian pressure isolated them diplomatically. Given these dependencies, accommodating Nigerian preferences was rational strategy for minimizing costs and maintaining stability, even when accommodation conflicted with sovereignty preferences. But the calculation was contingent on specific circumstances that could change rather than reflecting permanent power realities that could not change. Nigerian economic relationships were important when alternative suppliers were unavailable or more expensive, but they became replaceable when Chinese manufactured goods, Russian petroleum products, and Turkish processed foods provided competitive alternatives. ECOWAS security frameworks were valuable when countries lacked alternative security partnerships, but they became replaceable when Russia offered military equipment and training without political conditionality. Nigerian diplomatic relationships were important when countries lacked diverse international engagement, but they became less critical when countries built partnerships with China, Russia, Turkey, Iran, and other non-Western powers willing to engage bilaterally regardless of ECOWAS status. Once those calculations changed through reduced dependence and alternative partnerships, the deference ended immediately and permanently. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger simultaneously recognized that we had systematically reduced our vulnerabilities to Nigerian pressure to point where accommodation costs of continuing to defer to Nigerian preferences exceeded confrontation costs of asserting sovereignty. We withdrew from ECOWAS in January 2024 because continued membership constrained our sovereignty more than it benefited our security or development. We formed Alliance of Sahel states because regional coordination, independent of Nigerian dominance, served our interests better than ECOWAS frameworks that required Nigerian approval. We accepted diplomatic criticism from Nigeria and ECOWAS members because that criticism had no practical impact on our relationships with Russia, China, Turkey, and other partners whose engagement mattered more to us than maintaining good relations with Nigeria. The pattern was never a permanent feature of West African politics, reflecting Nigerian superiority as Nigerian officials assumed. The deference pattern reflected temporary power relationships that existed from ECOWAS, founding in 1975 through approximately 2023, when Sahelian countries' systematic vulnerability reduction reached critical threshold, enabling sovereignty assertion. During those roughly 50 years, Nigerian regional dominance appeared permanent, because the power relationships that enabled it remained relatively stable. Nigerian economy was largest in region throughout this period. Nigerian population remained largest. Nigerian military remained strongest. But what changed was not Nigerian power in absolute terms, but rather other countries' dependence on that power and availability of alternatives to Nigerian relationships. It was temporary circumstance reflecting specific power relationships that could change and did change when Sahelian countries systematically built alternatives and reduced dependencies. The change accelerated dramatically after 2020, when France's declining influence in Sahel created power vacuum that Russia eagerly filled. When China's Belt and Road Initiative expanded economic engagement throughout Africa, providing alternative to Western-dominated development models, when global oil prices increased, making Russia's petroleum exports more competitive, when Turkey expanded diplomatic and economic engagement in Africa under Erdogan's foreign policy, and when multiple military coups in Sahel brought to power leaders like me who prioritize sovereignty over maintaining relationships with traditional partners. By 2022 to 2023, the power relationships that had sustained Nigerian regional dominance for 50 years had changed fundamentally. Russia offered military partnerships that rivaled or exceeded what ECOWAS frameworks provided. China offered economic engagement that replaced Nigerian trade relationships. Alternative diplomatic partners provided international legitimacy, independent of ECOWAS. Regional coordination through AES replaced ECOWAS security cooperation. The combination of these changes meant that Nigerian leverage had declined to a point where Sahelian countries could afford to assert sovereignty that we previously could not defend. The deference pattern that appeared permanent proved temporary once the circumstances that created it changed. You were completely wrong about Burkina Faso because you applied assumptions about our behavior based on previous Burkinabe government's responses to Nigerian pressure without recognizing that leadership changes fundamentally altered our calculus. Previous Burkinabe governments led by Blaise Compaoré from 1987 to 2014 and Roch-Marc Christian Kabore from 2015 to 2022 did accommodate Nigerian preferences because they prioritized maintaining regional relationships over asserting maximum sovereignty. Compaoré maintained close relationships with France and accepted ECOWAS frameworks that gave Nigeria significant influence over Burkinabe security and economic policies. Kabore continued similar approach of accommodation and regional cooperation even as security situation in Burkina Faso deteriorated dramatically and foreign partners failed to provide effective support. Previous governments did avoid confrontation with Nigeria because they calculated that confrontation risks exceeded any benefit from asserting sovereignty on specific issues. When Nigerian preferences conflicted with Burkinabe interests, previous governments typically sought compromise or simply deferred to Nigerian positions rather than forcing confrontations that could damage bilateral relationships or complicate Burkina Faso's position within ECOWAS. This accommodation strategy was consistent with broader foreign policy approach that prioritized maintaining good relations with traditional partners, including France, Nigeria, and ECOWAS, even when those relationships limited Burkinabe's sovereignty or failed to address our security and development needs effectively. Previous governments did prioritize maintaining good relations over asserting sovereignty because they believed that Burkina Faso's size, poverty, and landlocked geography made us inherently dependent on external partners and regional relationships. They assumed that asserting sovereignty against Nigerian pressure would result in isolation and retaliation that would harm Burkinabe interests more than accommodation cost. They believed that working within ECOWAS frameworks and maintaining cooperative relationships with regional powers like Nigeria was only viable strategy for small Sahelian country facing severe security and development challenges. These beliefs shaped foreign policy that consistently deferred to Nigerian preferences and avoided confrontations that could test Nigerian willingness to retaliate. But those governments operated under different leadership with different priorities during different geopolitical circumstances that no longer apply. I came to power through military intervention on the 30th of September 2022, specifically because previous civilian government under Kabore failed to defend Burkina Faso's interests against foreign interference, failed to address deteriorating security situation effectively, and failed to assert sovereignty necessary for protecting our population. The military intervention was response to governance failure that left Burkina Faso vulnerable to terrorism, foreign exploitation, and continuing decline despite decades of following Western and regional partners' prescriptions for development and security. My government's entire purpose from day one has been correcting these failures by asserting sovereignty that previous governments failed to protect. My government's entire purpose is asserting sovereignty that previous governments failed to protect because I recognize that accommodation strategy had failed completely to serve Burkinabe interests. 50 years of accommodation produced deteriorating security with over 2 million displaced persons, continuing poverty with over 40% of population below poverty line, foreign exploitation of our gold resources with minimal benefit to our people, and declining state capacity despite extensive foreign assistance. The accommodation approach clearly was not working, and continuing to accommodate Nigerian preferences along with French dominance and Western guidance would simply produce more decades of failure. Asserting sovereignty and implementing policies that served Burkinabe interests regardless of foreign approval was necessary course correction after decades of failed accommodation. Your assumption that we would behave like previous governments was strategic error reflecting common pattern where dominant powers fail to recognize that leadership changes alter power relationships. Nigerian officials assumed that new Burkinabe leadership would eventually settle into accommodation patterns that previous governments established because those patterns had persisted across multiple leadership transitions. Compaoré accommodated Nigerian preferences. Kaboré accommodated Nigerian preferences. Transitional governments between Compaoré and Kaboré accommodated Nigerian preferences. The pattern appeared to transcend individual leaders and reflect structural realities of Burkina Faso's position in West African regional order. Nigerian officials failed to recognize that my leadership represented fundamental break rather than continuation of previous approaches. Your miscalculation revealed that your regional dominance is ending not because Nigerian power declined in absolute terms, but because other countries are no longer willing to accept that dominance voluntarily. Nigeria's GDP did not shrink. Nigerian military did not weaken. Nigerian population did not decrease. But Nigerian regional influence is collapsing because that influence depended on smaller countries' acceptance rather than on Nigerian ability to impose preferences through force. Once countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger rejected Nigerian influence and demonstrated that rejection was survivable, the foundation of Nigerian regional dominance crumbled. Other countries observing this dynamic recognize that they too can reject Nigerian dominance if they are willing to accept manageable costs of confrontation. My legacy is defending Burkina Faso's sovereignty by detaining your military aircraft despite your diplomatic pressure, ECOWAS support, and implicit threats of consequences. The detention was not emotional reaction or nationalist grandstanding. It was calculated strategic decision to enforce our sovereignty, test Nigerian willingness to escalate confrontation, establish precedent for other countries to follow, and demonstrate that Nigerian regional dominance is optional rather than mandatory. I knew detaining the aircraft would generate strong reactions from Nigeria, ECOWAS, and Western powers. I proceeded anyway because defending sovereignty is worth accepting diplomatic criticism, and I correctly assessed that Nigeria would not escalate beyond diplomatic pressure because costs of escalation exceeded any benefit Nigeria could gain from forcing compliance. I held your 11 officers for 24 hours until you provided diplomatic acknowledgement that landing occurred without proper authorization. The 24-hour duration was carefully chosen to balance multiple objectives. It was long enough to conduct thorough inspection of the aircraft and document surveillance equipment, proving the mission was intelligence operation rather than genuine emergency. It was long enough to send unmistakable message to Nigeria and West Africa that Burkina Faso will enforce sovereignty regardless of who violates it. It was long enough to force Nigerian diplomatic engagement and secure acknowledgement of improper procedures. It was short enough to avoid creating crisis that could justify Nigerian military response or provide basis for international condemnation of Burkina Faso as unreasonable actor. The calibrated timing achieved all strategic objectives without unnecessary escalation. I demonstrated that smaller countries can challenge regional hegemons successfully if they prioritize sovereignty over maintaining good relations. This demonstration is crucial because most countries assume that challenging hegemons requires military superiority or at least military parity. Burkina Faso proved that assumption wrong. We are militarily weaker than Nigeria by every conventional measure, but we successfully challenged Nigerian violation of our airspace because we were willing to accept confrontation costs that Nigeria was unwilling to escalate beyond. The lesson is that sovereignty is defended through political will and strategic positioning rather than through military superiority. Countries that reduce their vulnerability to hegemonic pressure through diversified partnerships and alternative frameworks can defend sovereignty against much larger powers. I proved that ECOWAS withdrawal enables independent foreign policy rather than limiting it. ECOWAS advocates claim that withdrawal would isolate Burkina Faso diplomatically, limit our policy options, and force us to reverse withdrawal after recognizing our dependence on ECOWAS frameworks. The opposite occurred. Withdrawal freed us from ECOWAS constraints on foreign policy, enabled us to build partnerships with Russia and China that ECOWAS membership discouraged, allowed us to implement security policies that ECOWAS opposed, and demonstrated that ECOWAS membership was limiting rather than enabling our sovereignty. The Nigerian aircraft detention was possible precisely because we withdrew from ECOWAS. If we remained members, ECOWAS pressure to release the aircraft would have been more effective because organizational solidarity would have required accommodation. Outside ECOWAS, that pressure was irrelevant. I showed other West African countries that resisting Nigerian pressure is viable strategy rather than national suicide. Before this incident, countries believed that confronting Nigeria would result in economic collapse through Nigerian sanctions, diplomatic isolation through ECOWAS, and potential military threats. Burkina Faso confronted Nigeria directly and experienced none of these catastrophic outcomes. Nigerian economic retaliation did not materialize. ECOWAS isolation was meaningless because we already withdrew. Military threats never emerged because Nigerian government recognized that military action over detained aircraft would be strategically counterproductive. The gap between feared consequences and actual outcomes proves that Nigerian power to punish countries that resist its preferences is far more limited than assumed. This proof encourages other countries to consider whether they too have been unnecessarily deferring to Nigerian preferences out of exaggerated fear of consequences. History will remember who defended their airspace when regional hegemon violated it and who would have accepted the violation to avoid confrontation. The historical record will show that when Nigerian military aircraft violated Burkina Faso's airspace without authorization on the 8th of December 2025, I immediately detained the aircraft and crew despite knowing it would generate international incident. The record will show that I maintained detention for 24 hours despite sustained Nigerian diplomatic pressure, ECOWAS condemnation, and Western calls for de-escalation. The record will show that Nigeria was forced to provide diplomatic acknowledgement of improper procedures before I released the aircraft. The record will prove that smaller countries successfully enforce sovereignty against regional hegemon and establish precedent that is reshaping West African regional order. The answer is written in that detained C-130 sitting on Bobo Dioulasso tarmac for 24 hours while Nigeria negotiated for its release. That image of Nigerian military aircraft under Burkinabe custody, surrounded by our security forces, immobilized despite Nigerian diplomatic efforts, will be remembered as symbol of shifting regional power dynamics. The aircraft represented Nigerian assumption of preferential access to West African airspace. Its detention represented rejection of that assumption and assertion of equal sovereignty. Its release only after Nigerian diplomatic concessions represented Nigerian recognition that smaller countries can no longer be taken for granted. The entire sequence was visible demonstration that regional power relationships are changing fundamentally. It is documented in AES statement supporting Burkina Faso against ECOWAS criticism. The Alliance of Sahel States issued joint statement on the 9th of December 2025, backing my decision to detain the aircraft and rejecting ECOWAS claims that detention was provocative or unnecessary. The AES statement declared that Nigerian aircraft violated Burkina Faso's airspace, that emergency landing explanation was unsubstantiated, that Burkina Faso acted appropriately to enforce sovereignty, and that ECOWAS had no authority to override sovereign decisions of countries that withdrew from the organization. This coordinated response demonstrated that Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger operate as alliance rather than isolated countries, that AES provides mutual support replacing what ECOWAS theoretically offered, and that alternative regional frameworks can effectively challenge ECOWAS positions. The AES support was crucial in enabling Burkina Faso to maintain detention despite pressure because it proved we were not isolated. It is proven in popular celebrations across West Africa when people recognize that smaller countries successfully challenged Nigerian dominance. Social media throughout the region exploded with commentary praising Burkina Faso's courage, questioning why other countries continue accepting Nigerian dominance, and celebrating that regional power hierarchies are being challenged. Street celebrations occurred in Ouagadougou when news spread that Nigerian aircraft had been detained. Public opinion surveys conducted across West Africa after the incident showed majority support for Burkina Faso's actions, even in countries whose governments officially criticized the detention. This popular support demonstrated that West African populations are frustrated with Nigerian regional dominance and receptive to leaders who challenge that dominance, creating political space for other governments to consider more independent positions toward Nigeria. Every assumption you made about your permanent regional superiority proved false through this single incident. You assumed smaller countries would never detain Nigerian military assets, proven false. You assumed diplomatic pressure would force quick release, proven false. You assumed ECOWAS support would compel Burkina Faso to reverse decision, proven false. You assumed we would fear economic retaliation enough to avoid confrontation, proven false. You assumed our withdrawal from ECOWAS left us isolated and vulnerable, proven false. You assumed your regional leadership position entitled you to preferential treatment, proven false. Each false assumption revealed that Nigerian regional dominance was built on beliefs and perceptions rather than overwhelming power, and that once those beliefs were challenged and disproven, the dominance began collapsing. Listen carefully. West Africa. Burkina Faso controls our airspace completely and will enforce that control regardless of who violates it. We detained Nigerian military aircraft when it landed without authorization. We will detain French military aircraft if they violate our airspace. We will detain American military aircraft if they enter without permission. We will detain any country's military aircraft that fails to follow proper authorization procedures. Our airspace sovereignty is absolute, non-negotiable, and will be defended against all violators regardless of their size, power, or regional status. This is fundamental principle of sovereignty that cannot be compromised through diplomatic pressure or organizational influence. Nigerian military aircraft require our authorization before landing in Burkina Faso, just like military aircraft from any other country. We do not provide preferential treatment based on Nigerian regional power. We do not waive authorization requirements because of ECOWAS history or West African solidarity. We do not accept emergency landing explanations without verification and proper communication. Nigerian military aircraft operating in West African airspace must request authorization from every country they enter, must explain their mission and route, must follow approved flight paths, and must communicate properly if genuine emergencies occur. These requirements are not negotiable, and violations will result in detention regardless of Nigerian government's preferences. ECOWAS has no authority over countries that withdrew from the organization. We withdrew from ECOWAS in January 2024 alongside Mali and Niger because the organization served Western and Nigerian interests rather than Sahelian security needs. That withdrawal was final and irreversible. ECOWAS statements regarding Burkina Faso carry no weight because we are not members and do not recognize ECOWAS authority over our sovereign decisions. ECOWAS cannot compel our compliance through organizational mechanisms. ECOWAS cannot sanction us effectively because we already operate outside its frameworks. ECOWAS cannot isolate us diplomatically because we built alternative partnerships replacing what ECOWAS theoretically provided. ECOWAS' condemnation of our actions is simply external criticism from organization we rejected, and that criticism has zero impact on our decision-making. Regional hegemons cannot override sovereignty of countries determined to defend it. This principle applies to Nigeria in West Africa, to South Africa in Southern Africa, to Ethiopia in East Africa, and to any other regional power that assumes dominance over neighboring countries. Hegemonic dominance depends on weaker countries' acceptance rather than on hegemons' ability to impose preferences through force. Once countries refuse to accept dominance and demonstrate that refusal is survivable, the hegemony begins dissolving. Nigeria's regional hegemony in West Africa is dissolving because Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger refuse to accept it and prove that life outside Nigerian influence is not only survivable, but preferable for countries prioritizing genuine sovereignty over maintaining good relations with regional hegemon. This is what post-ECOWAS West Africa looks like when smaller nations refuse to accept hierarchical relationships and assert equal sovereignty regardless of Nigerian power. It looks like detained Nigerian military aircraft sitting on tarmac in Bobo-Dioulasso while Nigeria negotiates for its release. It looks like Alliance of Sahel states issuing statements supporting member against ECOWAS criticism. It looks like West African populations celebrating smaller countries' courage to challenge regional hegemon. It looks like other West African countries questioning whether they too should assert more independence from Nigerian influence. It looks like fundamental shift in regional power dynamics from hierarchy toward genuine equality. It looks like Nigerian era of unquestioned dominance ending and new era of sovereign equality beginning. Your era of unquestioned dominance ended when that C-130 landed without permission on the 8th of December 2025, and I detained it anyway. That moment marked transition from old West African order, where Nigerian preferences dominated regional politics, to new order, where Nigerian influence must be earned through persuasion rather than assumed through power. The old order lasted from ECOWAS founding in 1975 through Burkina Faso's withdrawal in 2024, nearly 50 years of Nigerian regional leadership. The new order began when we withdrew from ECOWAS and accelerated when we detained your aircraft. Future historians will identify December 8 to 9, 2025, as decisive moment when Nigerian regional hegemony was broken and West African sovereign equality became viable alternative to hierarchical regional relationships. That legacy belongs to Burkina Faso and to every West African country that follows our example by asserting sovereignty over accommodation.